All right, here we go. I have often said if it's worth doing badly. I think that might come from G.K. Chesterton. There's always a hesitation in trying something new, and this is new to me. But over the years, I've been thinking that philosophy, physics, and mathematics, as well as even a certain amount of faith, should converge. And one day, I was thinking deeply about these things and ended up writing something and coming up with a concept that I think resonated with me, and I hope it resonates with you. It's the mathematical necessity of God and of the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. That is kind of a shocking statement, and it's meant to be, but I also think it's a logical one. So bear with me here. Having studied both physics and theology, as well as math, I have a biology degree, and I have a master's in financial planning, and I'm a financial advisor by profession, which does not qualify me for any of this. So I'll have to rely on the strength of the argument rather than credentials. So, but it seems to me that there's an insurmountable gap in the standard model of physics, that only being with God's mathematical characteristics could it be completed. An example, the universe is known to have a beginning, but before the beginning there was, by definition, no time. If there's no time, how can anything change? As all time is intrinsic to change, right? So change equals what you start with minus what you end with, divided by the time at the beginning and the time in the end. In other words, if there's no time, then there can be no transition from state one to state two. Therefore, how do you go from no universe to any universe? That is by definition change. It's a binary change. In a certain sense, it's an infinite change, right? The difference between 0 and 1 is infinite. You're going from absolutely nothing to even the smallest particle is something. In physics, the problem goes unanswered because of the fear of the implications and a desire to have a completely natural and, quote, scientific explanation that does not invoke a, quote, man in the sky to solve our problems. But the unintended consequence is that we lose the whole concept of cause and effect, right? The universe is an effect. What's the cause? But what if God is a scientific and even mathematical concept? What is meant by natural? Is it related to the cause and effect of the universe? The laws of nature? How, if there was a time before the universe or nature, how could natural laws themselves be? How could something that does not exist explain itself? In other words, if nature did not exist, the universe, equals 0, how could it bring about existence? The universe, equals 1. It is a silly and self-contradictory concept. For physics, invoking a mathematical concept for which there is no direct observational evidence should not be a foreign concept. Is this not what is done with dark matter and dark energy? We have observations for which the theories cannot account, right? For example, the way that galaxies move. The mathematical formulas predict something different than what is observed. So either you have to, 1, introduce a new unobservable concept, or 2, admit that the theory is wrong. In the case of dark matter and dark energy, most physicists have opted for an unobservable concept to solve the mathematical problem. Therefore, as there was, quote, a time without time, then math would require a reality outside of time that was eternal. Time equals 0. it would take power to cross the gap between a universe that doesn't exist, U equals 1, and one that does, U equals 1. This reality must therefore have power. Now the description for power is power equals force times distance divided by time. Therefore, as time, or t, approaches 0, power approaches infinity. Therefore, external and all-powerful are intrinsically connected. It is not hard to see that to bring a universe into existence, it would take infinite power. For if the first reality was not all-powerful, then the act of creation would use or deplete some of the power, and this in turn would imply a change in its state of being. Right? 100 minus 1 is 99. But if the power is infinite, then power minus anything is still infinite. Infinite minus 1 is still infinite. Therefore, it becomes conclusive that God's power must be infinite. In other words, if God's power is infinite, then it would still be infinite after using some of it to create. In science, we must hold to cause and effect. In a certain sense, we say that science is the study of cause and effect. Perhaps magic could be described as effects without an apparent cause. Now, if the first being could change, then there must be a cause to that change, or it would be magic. If there was a cause, then the cause of the first being's change would be the first being, right? Unless that being had a cause. Now, we can have an infinite number of beings causing a succession of beings, as this would create an infinite regression. An infinite regression is rejected really at least on 3 counts. 1, there would be no first cause, and if no first, then no second, etc. and ad nauseum. And there would be, therefore, no universe now, because there would be no cause to it. Right? If you have an infinite number of dominoes that go back, then there's no first domino to push. And if there's no first domino to push, then there's no second. And therefore, there's not going to be any dominoes knocked over now. 2, the universe cannot be indefinitely old because there is still usable energy. The second law of thermodynamics says it is entropy, which means that things go from order to disorder. That things are not in complete disorder proves that the universe is not infinitely old. Said another way, if you walk into a room with a warm cup of coffee, you know that it has not been there long. Otherwise, it would be cold or room temperature. And third, it is known that perpetual machines are impossible because they contradict the basic laws of physics. Okay, so we have a first cause without cause. That takes a little bit to sink in. So there is a thing that can cause other things, but nothing causes itself. Therefore, because this first being is immutable, it's not subject to change, it's eternal, and it's omnipotent. We've established all those things. It would be the first cause without cause. It is immutable because in 2 ways. The first, a state in which nothing exists. How can a thing change if it does not exist? This is the problem that we have with the idea of the universe bringing itself into existence. 2, everything exists simultaneously. If everything exists at the same time and in all places, then what is there to change? Whatever it would change into already exists. Since we have established that the first being must exist for the universe to exist, then we are forced to accept that all things must exist in the first being simultaneously. Yet this cannot include matter because it would create a contradiction. Matter is mutable or changeable, and there was a time without change. Therefore, all things existing must relate to knowledge and power. Now matter, a word on matter, power and energy are synonymous. And it is thought that E equals mc squared, that energy equals mass times the speed of light squared, or the speed of light times the speed of light. Or said another way, mass equals energy divided by the speed of light squared. Okay, just some basic algebra. It is therefore reasonable to tentatively conclude all matter is created and sustained by the literal power of the first being, that energy. Tentatively. Now, omniscience, or the knowing of all things. As we've seen above, because the first being is eternal, it must also be immutable, and this necessitates having all possible knowledge. We alluded to this or explained it above. For if it had only some knowledge, it would have the capacity to gain additional knowledge, and this would necessitate change, which would necessitate time and negate the possibility of it being the first being. But since it has been shown that physics and math require a first being, then it must be omniscient. Simplicity is an important concept. That does not mean easy to understand. So a correlate to omniscience is that the first being must be simple. Most people connote simplicity with easy or stupid. But those who have studied it have found it to be hard and genius. To make a mobile computer without any keys like the iPhone is much harder than to make many, such as with the BlackBerry. Perfect simplicity means there are no parts and no complexity. If there are parts, this would require time to change, going from 1 to 2 to 3, etc. The first being is eternal and cannot change, and is therefore simple and therefore one. Now wisdom. If knowledge is knowing things, then wisdom is knowing how things relate to one another and is derived from knowledge. If one were to know all things, then they would also know when a thing is heavier versus lighter, bigger versus smaller, lighter versus darker, better versus worse, and right versus wrong. Therefore, the first being would intrinsically know greater and lesser. And it would know that to love is greater than not to love. So love is greater than love equals 0. Now, if one has the power and knowledge, then it must do what it knows. For how could someone know that doing drugs is bad for them in every way and still do them? It is because the power to not do it is missing. So infinite knowledge times infinite power is an infinite action. If the first being knows that it is greater to love than not to love and has the power to do it, then it must. But love takes 3 to love, right? You need the lover, you need the beloved, and you need the love itself. I think a good analogy is magnets. You need a positive magnet, you need a negative one, and then you need the force that binds them together. Now, it has been established that there is only one being to its simplicity, but this one being must have 3 aspects to it. Christians have called this the Trinity. The Father, or the progenitor, the Son, or Word, the intellectual concept, and the Spirit, or power, to bind them together. If you had 2 magnets with an infinite force, it would unite the 2 into one inseparable being. To love another is greater than to not love another. So the first being would have no choice but to create a being to love. This is what necessitates our entire world and all of creation. It is the answer to why we are here. It is to be loved by the infinite first being. I feel like that gives me chills. That's worth pausing on. The ultimate reason we're here is not to serve God, not to love God, although all those things are important, not even to love one another. It's to be loved by God. That his very nature requires it. It's not required for him to exist, but his existence requires him to love one outside himself. So when those argue that they don't think there's a God that cares, it's the opposite. It is the literal exact opposite. The only reason anything exists is because God cares. And the word for care and the word from love come from the same root word. To love at a cost is greater than to not love at a cost. Yet how can anything cost an infinite being? The very thing that makes the infinite, but the first being would seem to be the thing that prevents perfect love, suffering. For infinity minus x is still infinity. So what's the solution? The incarnation. The solution is for the infinite being to completely unite itself in perfect love to a finite being so that their existence were but one. Put another way, to have one being with two natures, a human nature and a divine nature. In science, we see this with light, or the electromagnetic wave. Light is one entity, but it has two natures. It has a wave nature and a particle nature. In other words, it does everything a wave would do, and does everything a particle could do. But it's still just light. Just like Christ, who is the light of the world. To love at a greater cost is greater than to love at a small cost. Now the crucifixion is love at the greatest cost. The agonizing loss of life, betrayal, and abandonment of friends and humiliation. The first being seems to have had no choice but to go through the worst suffering in its humanity so as to love one outside of itself at an infinite cost. What makes the cost infinite is the one paying it. If an infinite being pays anything, then it is infinite. The humanity of Jesus is what allows for there to be a cost. The divinity of Jesus is what allows for the cost to be infinite. To use one's suffering to help others is greater than to not use one's suffering to help others. For Jesus, the God-man, not to use his suffering to help those who he was suffering for would be a contradiction. He had no choice but to apply the benefits of his torment to those whom he loved and chose to love. Likewise, God allows us to suffer so as to have the honor of following in his path and participating in his love. When tragedy strikes, we have a choice. One, bringing our share of misery into the world and bringing about spiritual and even physical death to ourselves and others. Or two, using our suffering to redeem others, to bring life and healing. Suffering is not the moral evil. Rejecting a God who created and died for us because he is love itself is the greatest moral evil. Suffering can be used to prove and to return this love, to settle the debt we owe this love. Now it is clear that the entire reason for our existence is so that the first being can love us, and that we can, in turn, return this love to him. But in a sphere, there is only one place that is special or unique: the center. Every other location has an infinite number of locations. This would imply that the earth and humanity itself is positioned in the unique place of the universe. The entire universe was formed and fashioned for the earth for man, and man for God. In a time of great distraction and even sin, it is easy to forget that there is an all-loving God who is waiting for us and prompting us to come to him in silence and in prayer. In my view, every subject that I have studied points and leads to this God, this personal God that wants to have a relationship with us and draw us into his heart in this world and then ultimately in the next. I hope this fun, well, it's fun to me, little intellectual excursion has helped in some way or allowed some light to go on that wasn't there before. Of course, this is just ideas that I've had. If you find them compelling, I hope you share that with me. And if you have thoughts or improvements, I love getting different perspectives. God bless.